Thanks very much, Joe. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks for those far too kind words. It's true what he said, that we bump into each other in various locations in Dublin over the summer, in theatres very frequently, in pubs occasionally. Long may it happen, indeed. And I wish I did have that lovely coin, but I think it may be in your office, unfortunately. How sad. We'll talk about it anyway. Thank you so much. And I am going to talk particularly about Digital Dubliners, which, as Joe has said, we launched for the centenary, of course, of the original publication of that fabulous collection of short stories. But more broadly, I'm going to speak about pedagogy, and even more broadly still, I'm going to dare to speak about that awful thing, digital humanities. I'd like to think that the projects that I have exemplify, in some ways, some of the things that English departments can particularly do with the digital humanities. But first, the cover of the thing there. The image was designed by ourselves, my students, and elaborated upon by the art department in Boston College. The nicely alliterative title there was chosen by my students. The name James Joyce in front is mimicking the font of James Joyce's own handwriting. And the subtitle, A Student's Guide for Students by Students, announces in brief the book's intent and its methodology. Dubliners. I didn't write Dubliners, as you might know, indeed, but with my students I produced, over the course of 2 years, from conception to final launch, a product which I think is a Dubliners quite unlike any other one that's out there. We took the original text, we enhanced or embellished or buttressed it, I suppose you might say, by adding 40 short video pieces, 30 to 35 audio pieces, over 300 images, over 700 of our own separate annotations and glosses, to a total of about 80,000 words in 400 iBook pages that take about 1 gigabyte of space. It was a pretty major operation, but it all began in the classroom, and it was essentially completed in the classroom, and always by students. What's inside these covers I'm going to show you a little bit later on, but I'm going to first take a little bit of time just to talk about my own, the story of Digital Dubliners, which happens to be more or less the story of my own introduction to digital humanities. This tentative journey began about 5 years ago when teaching a Ulysses class, the first time in Boston College that it was a single semester devoted to that single book. I knew I had to get my students engaged in it. And just some short time before that, Google Earth had appeared, and we thought this might be a way to perhaps map the movement of the characters across Dublin. At the time, it was a relatively reasonable, original idea, though Nabokov, who of course had taught Ulysses, suggested it long before. He said, "Don't theorize this book," he said, "draw this book, draw these movements." Thankfully, along came Google to enable us to do that actually en masse and to go a little bit further. And over the course of the next few weeks, we added speech bubbles, little notations, little buildings on the map. And it was all beginning to look fairly rough by today's standards, but still worth working on. We ran out of space, and we got permission from Google to expand the capabilities. And next thing, we had a website, a downloadable website called Walking Ulysses. We were quite pleased with ourselves in that. The next semester, the students, more ambitious than I, decided to go further. And in fact, we decided to develop an iPhone app. And that's actually what we did. The iPhone app was called Joyce Ways. And here's just a few excerpts from it. The voice you're hearing there is Frank Delaney, who did this for us actually for free. We got David Norris to actually add to it. I have to show you some of this because, of course, David being outrageous as always.
She said to them, "You will not mock this beautiful music which Mr. Joyce and I sang so often in Paris in the 1920s. You will see it again, and this time with due respect." And she said, "Oh."
That's David Norris, the inimitable David Norris. And here are just some clips from the app which we produced. How do we finance it? Well, actually, the students came together and we launched a Kickstarter campaign, and we raised $15,000 from that. And that essentially paid for the production of this thing. Boston College were very helpful to us, as our universities are. Happily, this is the time to be involved in digital humanities. You can extract money from deans these days that you might not be able to get next year, but they don't necessarily do commercial propositions. So this was Joyce Ways, available for what it's worth actually on on iTunes, indeed, at just $2.99. It's been a great success, and it won the award as the best tourist app in Ireland last year. So what I actually did then, what that was about in producing that, the process I want to speak about for a couple of seconds. We began, of course, by simply examining the original text. We then, the students, sat down to scouring the internet for relevant information, downloading that data into a storage system like Dropbox, mapping the locations, as I mentioned, grabbing sound files, mainly from archive.org, then working with images, which we downloaded for the most part, mainly in the public domain, some we made ourselves, manipulating those images, and finally putting that out there, publishing it electronically on iTunes. So what I was doing, I thought I was teaching Ulysses, but I discovered soon that as the term began to swirl around the university campuses, that I was in fact doing digital humanities. I was very pleased with myself, something like that gentleman you might remember in that bourgeois gentleman in Molière who, on discovering that he had been speaking prose all his life, congratulated himself on his erudition. I was something similar. I'm talking about digital humanities, that term that I think we feel is easy enough to detest before even we quite understand it. It's no surprise that it became the object of, well, ridicule. Let's have a look. And reaction.
Steiner konnte nicht genügend Kräfte für einen Angriff massieren. Der Angriff Steiner ist nicht erfolgt.
Es bleiben im Raum Keitel, Jodel, Krebs und Butter. Das war ein Befehl! Der Angriff Steiners war ein Befehl!
Not all authorities welcome digital humanities into the classroom, but it's here and it's here to stay. I want to say something about it. Listen, how do we define it? It's like that elephant that we're not quite sure how to define, but we know it perhaps when we see it. And I think that one way to think about digital humanities, to recognize it, may be to look at some of these projects and to see what we can note about them. Like in Joyce Ways, as in Digital Dubliners, in its form, digital humanities is project-based. In its conception, exploratory. In its execution, collaborative. By definition, cross-disciplinary, drawing from a series of intellectual traditions. Invariably multifarious, combining some or all of text, spoken word, audio files, images, still perhaps are moving, and in its final object, curated and made widely available, preferably in the public domain. So there it is. It's about using the tools. That's how I became a digital humanist, if I dare to call myself that. And if I can give advice to my colleagues back in Boston College, what I say is quite simply, try and do it. Immerse yourself in the stuff. Increasingly, the stuff that's there available on the shelves, as is the stuff that we use for Digital Dubliners, is very, very easy to use. So that was my first venture. That was Joyce Ways. And now to return to the book, Digital Dubliners. When I began with this project there were various questions and doubts in my mind. Some of them were professional and some almost existential. The obvious challenge, of course, immediately was one of material, financial and the logistical questions. But as I said, this is a good time to prod your dean. If you're doing anything that seems to be adventurous in pedagogy, there tends to be some finance going there. The next question I wondered about, of course, was whether Joyce critics themselves might actually, what would they think about this thing? Who was I to dare to produce a text like this? But in fact, I reassured myself that Joyce critics, indeed Joyceans, have always been in the front of experimentation. Fully 20 years ago it is since a critical journal with the pretty novel title of Joyce Hypermedia Studies appeared. And the startled readers of that were confronted with essays with such outlandish topics as Joyce in cyberspace and Ulysses and chaos theory. Soon enough, e-texts of Dubliners, hypertext volumes of Ulysses, electronic concordances of Finnegan's Wake began to pop up on academic computer screens. Joyceans, wielding terms like technopoetics, digiculture, and mediality, sent menacing buzzes perhaps around otherwise dusty English department corridors. Digital humanities were coming. Indeed, in the minds of many Joyceans, had arrived long before the term came to be used daily, if not, I'm afraid, hourly. And then I wonder, would Joyce himself have approved? And of course, it was easy to satisfy myself on that account. His interest in technology is fairly widely known. Certainly the fact that it was he who opened the first commercial cinema, the Volta, in Dublin. Readers of Ulysses, of course, will know Mr. Bloom's fascination with the mechanical and the technological, the scientific and the new. Readers of Finnegan's Wake will be very aware that it's crammed with reference to post-Newtonian physics. I don't think that I need that. Sorry, guys. If I can remove it, I hope. I hope. Okay. Cancel. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Yes, I said that Finnegan's Wake, of course, if you're lucky enough, if you're silly enough, foolish enough to read that, and I and my little group in Boston College have been reading it for 12 years now with little enough success, I should say, will find it crammed with relativity theories, with quantum mechanics, with wave-particle duality. Of course, radio and telephone and cinema are sprinkled throughout it. And maybe more surprising, but absolutely delightful to me, is the presence quite frequently of television, remembering that this book was written in the pre-war era, what Joyce calls the Blairy board bombardus screen. Blair was the name of the Scotsman who first invented what I think was actually kind of a mechanical television. So the Blairy board bombardment screen was his title for what we now call televisions. So I had satisfied myself on those accounts, on Joyce's account and on the critic's account. This was a safe thing to do, to go ahead with this digital text. But I wondered again if I actually dared to do an e-book because of my own uncertainties about e-books. Maybe 3 years ago, I was looking down my nose at people whom I saw going around with their little electronic books. Too fond I was of my beautiful books. I never imagined that I myself was going to be one who would concede to that these electronic texts were the proper things for people of my position actually to read. That changed. And at the moment of my revelation, I wonder if anything like this has happened to you, was in fact lying in bed one night when I was trying to read that huge volume of Diarmuid MacCullough's History of Christianity. There's about 1,000 pages there, and really it's a heavy book anyway, and trying to balance it. Of course, I'd read many heavy books before, but this was the first time for me for which there was a ready alternative. And after that, things had changed. Every heavy book since then has weighed twice as much upon me. The question remained whether I had, of course, the intellectual rights, so to speak, to do this. Far more erudite people than I had brought out texts of Dubliners. But if I did have a warrant for this, I think it lay perhaps in the classroom. In teaching Dubliners, often to younger students, who know the great author only by his fearsome reputation, the imperative for me is to overcome some misconceptions, and particularly their misconceptions about who James Joyce was. A behatted, they think, bespectacled old gent with cane and glasses, tottering through perhaps the late Middle Ages, it must seem to them. But no, I explain, actually, when he began to write The Sisters, he was 21 years of age. Joyce was something like your age. And that, I think, was when I could claim some justification for this project. That confluence, we might say, was behind the mission statement that the students themselves drew up at the beginning of that semester. And this is what they wrote. We are, they said, 15 students of Boston College. We are young college writers. We identified with James Joyce. The stories of Dubliners, they said, were written by him, a young man more or less our age. Who better, they wrote, who better, we dared to think, than us to bring them to an audience our age. And so thus was set in motion Digital Dubliners, a student's guide for students. And I'm going to show you just a little bit of what that looks like now. It's it was done using iBooks Author. And I'm going to go right back to the beginning of it. And 15 students in a class of undergraduates in a junior seminar. And this is kind of what it looks like. It begins, as any textbook might do, with acknowledgements, with contents, but then maybe, perhaps not so surprising, how to use this book, with the built-in dictionary, with telling people about note-taking and highlighting, explaining the annotations and glosses, how the images work, where to go, and the various elements of it. We go on, and I'm going to skip that for a second to say that the very first thing is a map of the city, which is sort of interactive. That's to say is that one can move around and find the various details of where the particular stories took place. And we begin with childhood. And I'll tell you the first story here, for example. Well, look, I'm leaping ahead of myself here. But it was very important for us here, while this was the work of the students, that it should have some critical heft. And I was very, very pleased to be offered the expertise of perhaps two of the most important Joyceans in America, in the world indeed. On the left, Professor Vicky Mahaffey.
I put a lot of emphasis on Joyce's description of Dublin as his nicely polished looking glass.
And on the right, Professor Joseph Valenti.
As if it's straightforward, what Joyce called a style of scrupulous meanness. It seems like a very straightforward business, but in fact it's not. The beauty of Dubliners, and I will say this about Dubliners, I'm a Joycean, and I've read all of Joyce's work many times, and it may be that I think Ulysses is the greatest novel that I've ever read, and I do, but also I've read Ulysses, I don't know, 15, 20 times, however many. And my enjoyment of Ulysses at this point is as high as it's been.
Enough to the texts themselves. And as wonderful as these experts were, it was my students themselves. It was very important for me that they should have ownership of this.
Hi,
And here, for example, is
I'm a
Zaman.
junior studying English and International Studies, and my story is The Sisters. As the first story in Dubliners, Joyce uses the sisters as a teaching tool for how he wants us to read the rest of Dubliners, but also all of fiction. For example, he focuses...
And they write the introductions, but then, of course, the real work was the work of research, which they did. Each story begins with a contemporary map, which is kind of a nice little thing, just to show them what it might have looked like, somebody looking at a map at the time. We have images, perhaps, of gnomons there, that G-N-O-M-O-N, that nobody's too sure about. But in fact, if that wasn't enough for you, and you still didn't get the idea of the gnomon was, well, look, let's actually make a gnomon operate for you there. It's a small little thing, but it was fun to do. We have also got images of the text, and these come up in sort of galleries, so that you can look here, for example, at exactly the Euclid, and indeed surely the exact edition that James Joyce, we can say with fair certainty, was reading about, and where surely he first came across the word gnomon as it is there. Across the text, of course, I needn't tell you that you can, of course, highlight them and underline them in the various ways. In the margins here, we have their other contributions. Some nice work here on this again from the De Harp Catechism that Joyce had off by heart. When does a person commit simony? When he buys or sells spiritual things, etc. Pears soap there. And statistics in this, which of course you can bring up to full size, telling you about deaths in Dublin. Death is central, of course, to these texts. Chalices. Look, not everybody knows what a chalice is. So, you know, nowadays you've got to make things, I suppose, simple. Yeah, gonorrhea. What's that doing in there? That's pretty important in this text too, actually, okay? The Freeman's Journal here, taken more about religious life in Dublin. These galleries of images taken from what it was like, actually what people would have known about the clergy at the time, are of some importance for us here. Going on, each one finishes with the office hours, where again we have the experts giving their take on the particular story before moving on to what was one of the central parts of these texts, because this was taught in an English department. Students are being taught to write, to edit, to research as well. This essay, the student's essay here, was the central part, you might say, of the text. And something more, well, yes, let's say here, more research here, Death of Dublin. We dared to play around with sacred images by Gustave Doré. Disgraceful, but there you are. and more statistics taken from the births and deaths registries in Dublin at the time, images of how death, and these annotated bibliographies that each student did. And I think to produce in each story as complete a work as we possibly can. I'm going to go up to one of the other stories here, one of my favourite ones, and not everybody's favourite, and that's the story After the Race. It was Joyce's least favourite, and it's many of our students' least favourite. How do you make that interesting to people? Well, the student here was Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Doyle, and I'm a sophomore. I really like After the Race because it's...
And she did some serious work, and she looked around, and finally she came up with this. Okay. From Patha News. Actual footage of the actual 1903 race that Joyce was looking at, was watching, and that he describes within the text. No textbook is going to do that kind of thing. Going on a little bit further with the various images of the streets and the place and whatever else. And what about the music there? Quai de Roussel, performed by this French song, which is mentioned within the text. Well, anyone can do that, but it happens to be actually a contemporary recording and might very well have been what Joyce would have had in mind when he was thinking of that at the time. I could go through all the stories, but I'm not going to tire you with them. But there's one nice one I also like, actually, is Clay, done by Sean Cahill, a very, very fabulous student. Let me say, as an afterthought, actually, that most of these students have moved on. And out of that 15, they have all done rather well. This particular project, to be able to show, coming out of school, that they had already the capacity, not simply to know about English literature or a particular element of English literature, but they knew about management, they knew about how to handle a project, how to begin and finish it, and they could actually show something that was commercially available. It stood to them very, very, very well, actually. Digital humanities can be a passport into the future in a way that alleviates the concerns of many students and very many parents. I like particularly Sean's work on Clay here for a number of reasons. Here, taken from Tom's directory, is an actual advertisement, of course, for the actual Dublin by Lamplight laundry in which Maria in Clay is working. And here a census of the actual census with, and he has nicely noted it here, with the names of the actual people who were working there at the time that the story was set, or at least 2 years before it. Of course, the usual annotations, and I particularly like that he has this lovely recording, of course, of this most melancholic and beautiful song, the one which you might recall Maria was unable to recall the second verse of, that in that really moment of desperate sadness. The recording again was from 1904, and I think it very likely that Joyce would have heard it and would have been familiar with Edith Chapman singing that exquisite song. And again, yes, actually one other thing, in fact, is, yes, here's the essay, Sean's very, very wonderful essay. And so much of it was actually about the students speaking in their own voice to students and trying to give them their own particular experience rather than speaking down to them. I think that was really central to this. And he also has here, actually, as we have in the other 3 cases, 4 of these stories from Dubliners, you probably know, were 3 were published in the Irish Homestead beforehand, and we give those original editions. Fascinating to compare where Joyce went from the first to the final edition. And here's one of Clay, which he submitted, but in fact didn't get published. And it was also important for us that the students, that they should be made, the relevance of these stories today should be emphasised. And here, pursuing the questions of those laundries in Ireland and where they went to, with connections to, links to Irish television and radio. I won't bore you with any more, except just to show you that at the very end we have this other nice little piece called Additional Content, which I think rather works, in which we have some video and images of the classroom and the process that we documented along the way over the course of the 2 semesters doing this, that brought this to its fruition. And then something about Joyce Ways, and finally some biographical stuff on Joyce the musician, with a number of recordings of him speaking, something of a biography, and then this lovely piece, of course, with which you'll be familiar. of Joyce on film. We've got, I think, as far as I know, perhaps the only piece of film that we have of him. So that's Digital Dubliners. There's an awful lot more to it, and I'd be very happy to show you it. The nice thing about it is that if you've got an Apple, an iPad, or an Airbook, or any kind of a Mac computer indeed, with iBooks, and it comes almost automatically now with iBooks on your latest operating system, you can download this for free. So no charge, and as a teaching tool, a number of my colleagues have used it and find it wonderful in the classroom. But apart from that, I like to think that even though it's for students, by students, for students, that it's a resource, our own little contribution to make Joyce that little bit more accessible than he was. I'm going to talk a little bit more, if I may, just actually about books and about the future of digital humanities and where we go from here. And as I say, actually, I have an iPad here, and you're welcome to look at more if you wish afterwards. I just wonder, and as people do, what happens here. The demise, I suggest, the imminent demise of our beloved paper book that was first announced, what I suppose maybe 10 or maybe even 15 years ago, has caused a lot of weeping, and its death is still being commonly proclaimed. The rumour is still being exaggerated, and teeth are still being gnashed at the prospect. But I think that we don't actually have to worry, that the book, no more than Tim Finnegan, was never really actually dead, the paper book. In fact, I believe that we're living through, if anything, a sort of a birth. We're at a moment, we're lucky enough to be at a moment of startling transformation. Reading, what's been called the techno-cultural puzzle, is taking a spectacular turn, and we're here to witness it, to be changed by it, and indeed to be part of that change. And we can thank the internet for that. Of course, we're attached to our papery old books. Our loyalty to them runs deep. Long-time companions, gentle educators, vehicles for the vicarious thrills and pains that we don't dare risk for ourselves. They've made us what we are, and we love our books for that. Providers of fond memories. We know the feel and the smell of them. We admire their proud presence on our bookshelf, reassuring by our bed, comforting in our pocket. It's hard to feel that sort of affection for your Kindle, for your tablet, or for your iPad, no matter how sleek or slim or compact or indeed hip it is. There was a time as long ago as last year, perhaps, when being seen with your tablet provided a certain ego boost, a pleasing assertion of technological nous. It's no longer really cool, I'm afraid, to be seen with a Kindle. Sorry, Kindle users. There's not a lot of street cred there. And as for actually using the tablet, Jonathan Franzen voices an almost existential fear when he bemoans the shifting, ephemeral effect of reading on a screen that will be wiped clean, like our aging memories, like our mortal selves. The printed page, on the other hand, has long provided the reassuring illusion, at least, of permanence. In our earliest encounters with the school book, we learned what learning means. Our eyes moving across the page, we knew that the words these letters made, these ideas that these squiggles embodied, were becoming, even as we struggled by some extraordinary magic, imprinted inside our heads. Books yielded up their secrets to us, to be made by us into our own. It was, of course, a one-way street, a vertical transfer of cultural norms. Norms, of course, though seldom power, from them to us, from authoritative writer to humble reader. Books were things to be read, not to be written, at least not by you and me, it seemed then. But that's changing. The book, the great civilizing agent of the modern era, is taking a demotic turn. The printed page is making way, and not stepping out of the way, simply making way for the network screen. The internet and the e-book have a horizontal energy. The expansive power of that horizontal energy can best be seen in a classroom full of tech-savvy, computer-wielding, iPad-using, twittering students. In those spaces, the internet has subverted the top-down model of pedagogy. And this is really the most important message, I think, that the change is being impressed upon us by the liberation of our students. And these students who are no longer content to be mere absorbers of information can now, thanks to technology, become manufacturers and disseminators of knowledge. producers of information to be shared, not just with me, the teacher, not just with themselves, their classmates, but with the college, with the country. I mean, even more, with the world, we can actually say, through the magic of e-publishing. Students' guides for students everywhere is the prospect. And I find that ridiculous, and I find it astonishing, and I find it hugely hope-giving. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe.
Not at all.
I think we set aside some time here to have some discussion about not only the project, but I think it's fair to talk about where we're the larger subject of digital humanities and how we're using this in our classrooms. And a number of you are graduate students or are teachers or are thinking about becoming teachers, so I think this is very relevant. Could I just ask you at sort of nuts and bolts to sort of start this out for, and we're just going to take maybe, what time is it?
22.
Yeah, maybe 10 minutes or so. So if you have a question, because I know other people have things and we have to pass them a little bit. Just in terms of nuts and bolts, in terms of setting up, you had a 2-semester course. Did every student have iPads? Did every student, I mean, what were the requirements for enrolling, and how did that sort of stuff work?
Okay, and the nuts and bolts is really what it's about. When we get over the fear of the thing, our own anxieties about that, I can tell you those quite easily. And first of all, I want to say is that I'm talking about stuff that's on the shelf. When I first thought about this project, I imagined I was going to have to put aside a full half a semester simply for the students to get familiar with the technology. In the meantime, up came Apple and they produced iBooks Author, and that was solved. It happened then that within 2 weeks, the students put down in front of the computer with the tutor, with the tutorial, were able to work with iBooks Author themselves. By a month had gone by, they were more than proficient. It's about as intuitive as Apple makes intuitive stuff, indeed. It was, in fact, produced for the most part in a single semester with 15 students. Now, by the end of that, and I said it was absolutely vital that each student had ownership of their one, so that's why I put in the videos of themselves, so they knew that that was their little baby, indeed. By the end of that semester, we had 15 rough stories that were quite acceptable. Not good enough for the market, but quite acceptable, actually. The second semester didn't involve a class at all, indeed, but 3 research assistants working for me under the undergraduate research funding scheme. These were my assistants, and they worked small hours, but they were so excited by it. I had carefully chosen the students, I should say, from the beginning. I publicized this course rather broadly, and I had about 40 applicants to get into this. And I chose the best people. I chose the guys and the girls who were into editing, who loved writing, who wanted to produce something like that. They didn't necessarily have to know about technology. So that's what kind of set it up. There was one other very important thing. Of course, each one had to be in charge of their own little piece, but I also divided them up into 4 different groups. And one was in charge, the most important was the editorial board. And they read every piece and reread and sent it back and that. Another one was in charge of marketing, and I brought in some kids from the business school who gave their little expertise. A third one was in charge of technology and audio, and the fourth one was layout and things. So each group, everybody had to have ownership of the whole lot as well, having their own experience. I guess it sounds like a huge undertaking, but they were carried on by their enthusiasm and the excitement that it generated. And this is when I say about the horizontal energy, the fact that they could see down the road that they were putting their name onto a book that was going to be out there, turning up in classrooms. That's what provided it all. The amount of funding I got was relatively little. I needed very little funding. The only things that we really had to pay for was that Path and Use thing, which cost about $500, and the image from the National Library of Ireland, about another $300. And I think the extra bits and pieces, maybe I got about $2,500 in grants for the entire project. But it was the dedication, first of the class, but then of 3 or 4 guys who worked the next semester and throughout one summer, one particular guy who was in love with the project, and that brought it to that state that it was on. And we've been working on it since, actually. I have another research assistant, and we're going to put out, actually, edition 2 to cover up some of the little gaps that are in there in the next couple of months. If that helps you. The mechanics means, I'm just saying that the levers were easy to pull. Yeah. Sure. Oh, let me just say one more thing. I'm sorry, is that one marvelous thing about doing this kind of thing is that even though the machinery is out there from iBook's author, one of the complaints about digital humanities is that it's too mechanical, that it's not about analysis. But that's not the case, because what we had to do, there was intellectual work there. We had to rethink, what is a footnote with this? I mean, what does it mean to gloss? The students had to work that thing out themselves. So there was real deep intellectual effort in coming up with this. All you have from Apple is a template, a kind of blank spaces like on an album, and you have to put in all the things and decide actually what constitutes what. There was fierce arguments in the classroom, believe me, between those who wanted glossings and those who wanted annotations, and those who wanted the images here, and those who believed that there was no right to put anything that wasn't absolutely contemporaneous. Did you dare move out? We played around with some images. There were some modern images there that were sort of antiqued a little bit. Was that right? Some people were very against it. So, yeah, so there was much intellectual work in there. Thanks. Sorry, excuse me.
No, it's fine. I was curious about the output of fully control of the intellectual project. So, did your editorial board of students have final say over everything? And was everything, did every student produce something that as an instructor you felt was of that?
By no means. By no means. By no means. The best of it was absolutely marvellous. The worst of it was pretty poor. There was 2 or 3 people, and I made mistakes. I shouldn't have actually had them in the class, and there was a lot of work had to be done to correct them. I had final control over everything. And we also, indeed, in the funding, I should have mentioned that we had about $1,000 one summer, where I happened to have a graduate student, a PhD candidate, who was working on the editorial board of ERA Ireland, and we employed her to do final professional editing, indeed. Absolutely, yes. Yeah, how are you?
I love your point about the sort of horizontal axis, and I think that one reason I work so well with Joyce is that teaching Ulysses always does that to you. You realize you can't have mastered everything in the classroom, so it makes sense to me why it would be a great jumping off point.
Thanks. Thank you.
Any trouble from Stephen Joyce, copyright issues?
You know, I don't know what's happened to Stephen Joyce. He has been tamed, has he? I mean, he's vanished from the airwaves.
Well, not entirely. It was
Really?
an essay where they didn't want two lines of poetry had to be taken out because
How recently?
the Memory Ireland just last semester.
He
So,
didn't.
But he's mostly contained because of the copyright.
Right.
Everything's out of copyright except for a few things that he's holding on to.
It was certainly in my mind. Of course, questions of public access were very important throughout this. It's astonishing the amount of stuff that's coming into the public domain. Remember that the British Library issued, 1 million documents put into the public domain there a few months ago. The Irish National Library followed up with putting in either 10 or 100,000, and all that stuff has become. We've gotten so much stuff from the Library of Congress here, even from Wikipedia and from Wikipedia Commons, and we might have taken chances here and there, but you know, we'll take the chances, and if somebody wants to come after us, then they can chase me. We're giving it away for nothing. Even Stephen Joyce can't grab anything from me. Okay.
Is there another question?
Hey, how are you?
Since this is so technology dependent, and you talked about how it's fairly intuitive using Apple products, but Apple products aren't always priced at sort of the level where access is open to everyone. Does that become an issue as digital humanities expands, the access to the technology needed to participate?
That's a very fair question, actually, and it was one, of course, that we had to face when we began, indeed. The limitations, it means that the only people who can use this are Mac users. I wish this were available to the entire world, and that certainly caused a problem in the classroom. This is aimed at the high school or perhaps at maybe freshman classes in college. High schools have been adopting it because there are many high schools there that are entirely Apple provision. But it's really, really sad that we can't do this for everybody. We live within the circumstances that are there. The truth is that Apple does very, very intuitive stuff. I don't think we could have made it as beautiful as it is without IBA. That's it. Apple were very helpful to us, actually. They sent experts down, and people held our hand along the way. They were quite kind. This project is a huge project, of course. There's no need for anyone to go that far. But as a small project in pretty well any classroom, if you've got students, if you are like us in Boston College, you're essentially a Mac university. If your students have got a preponderance, or maybe almost all have to have Macs, if they have, to take any small story, any piece of work you're working on, and let the students over the course of a semester as individual projects pull together 2 or 3 pages. By the end of the semester, you can very easily have a small book. It's not going to look as glittering as that, but they'll have learned technology. They'll send them down a road that they will in all likelihood enjoy hugely. Yeah.
We give Joe, Professor Nugent.
Thanks, guys.